Adesso andiamo a presentare appunto la prima relatrice di oggi. Io ringrazio Marianna Zummo, la introduco brevemente, anche se insomma assolutamente direi che è giusto così. Marianna Zummo insegna lingua e traduzione inglese presso il Dipartimento di Scienze Umanistiche dell'Università di Palermo, dove tiene anche corsi, oltre che di lingua, anche di didattica della lingua inglese. Si interessa di dinamiche comunicative, studi della modalità e della evidentiality e della comunicazione nell'ambito sanitario e della salute. Il suo ultimo lavoro è Computer Mediated Communication in Class, Fostering Access to Digital Mediascapes, uscito nel 2024 e di cui è editor con Stefania Maci. Il titolo della sua presentazione oggi è Digital Interactional Grounds and Ideologies. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for being here. I'm sorry because, again, I'm going to read, I'm afraid, but that's it. I'm here, so. Okay, as a linguist, I try to perform a range of language interpretation, often using what? Often using what? What happened? Yeah, so this one. Okay, so I often use one of these methodologies. My research is mainly focused on the analysis of the digital space, the spaces. So basically, I learn the dialogues trying to investigate how web users use the platforms to post ideological-driven comments and eventually create echo chambers. The notion of echo chambers emerges as net users tend to participate in online debates only with compatible communities sharing the same narratives, looking for and interpreting information in a way that confirms one's hypothesis with little or no consideration for alternative options. Web users are exposed to an incredible amount of information that is selected by confirmation bias, so the search and interpretation of information is consistent with one's own belief. This process leads to confirmation niches in which very similar information are shared, echoing each other, with the result that beliefs are reinforced. In confirmation niche, the truth value of the information is not salient. What matters is the rhetorical and persuasive features that are used in the digital debate. So let me repeat. If a claim is made by one user and is repeated, exaggerated, or distorted by like-minded participants, it will ultimately reinforce the community's belief system, forming echo chambers. I'm going to tell you how to adapt conversation analysis tools to online context and use it to explore data. I brought a case study in which people construct a debate and show group identities and ideologies. Every consideration starts by looking at digital interactional spaces as an example of participatory platform and a milieu for consensus finding. The online discussion boards are an important part of the digital experience, as discussions are organized as multi-party conversations on several topics by several participants at different level of expertise. So the platforms become the fastest way to obtain easily available information, and they offer a space to any position, even those opposite to the mainstream. The digital exchange is based on users' participation. Contributions vary according to the action that the participant accomplishes, and as such, we have readers, likers, and commenters. One can conceivably read a post, like it, and then elaborate on one's reasons for liking it with constructive, positive, or negative comments or disruptive comments. And these are three different actions. Before starting, we should say something about ethics and the ethical challenges when we carry on the analysis of publicly available data. Despite many rules of conduct, there are no widely accepted protocols for how researchers should collect, analyze, and present publicly posted comments ethically. Although there is a generally low expectation of privacy for those who post publicly on social networks, usernames, images, pictures are generally removed, and only part of the posts are used to show evidence to preserve individual cyber rights. Okay, now I've already said that the platforms are the fastest way to obtain information, and they offer a space to any position. An example is the controversial issue of vaccines. We have very vivid the memory of the pandemic, COVID-19, and all that sort of that time. But here I'm talking about autism and the MMR vaccine and the possible correlation, and I'm saying possible for a reason, between MMR vaccine and autism. This debate has inflamed social discussions with the medical community, encouraging individuals to vaccinate, and the public concerned with efficacy and safety. The challenge in my investigation is to study the asynchronous form as a token interaction venue and in light of the notion of confirmation niche. The case study I brought here analyzes the dialogic structure in an asynchronous discussion, which means I adapt conversation analysis to online written texts to study sequentiality, accountability, conflict, and the confirmation niche. Why digital conversation analysis? Because I applied traditional spoken analysis approaches to understand the nature of computer-mediated interaction, because online exchanges do meet conversation criteria, and just to have a rough idea of what I'm talking about, this is a sequence. It is a dialogue between Shelley and Debbie. There are 4 turns, and if the first sentence where Debbie, you were at the Halloween thing, that Debbie would be the addressing. Right. It is easier doing conversation analysis with synchronous interactions like Meet, Skype, and these platforms. With asynchronous exchanges, turn takings, agency pairs, and sequences are on a different level. Gibson showed the asynchronous written discourse display a similar nature to face-to-face interactions, but some differences remain. For example, comments are posted one after another, suggesting a sequence of turns with similar conversational talk patterns, but often without a logical sequence. Participants take turns depending on when they log on, and consequently, reading paths are necessary to understand how the posts are organized and related to each other. Accountability aims at understanding how people manage their image or reputation. And this is particularly interesting when dealing with the discourse around vaccines, in which medical experts are replaced by currents with their experience and emotions. My corpus is a set of 188 comments posted from July 2010 and April 2013, so very old. The web page where these comments appear is a site for online shopping, Amazon. But in the past, they also had a forum for customers, which cannot be thought as reputable for health matters, but it was the first thread dealing with vaccine and autism. It was the most accessed at time of selection, so I chose it. An initial post on July the 17th receives 187 replies and starts a debate among 67 participants. Participation varies from one post 45 participants to 30 posts with messages addressed to the forum in general or to specific participants. There's also a way to there's also a way to like the post using the yes/no button that answer the question X out of Y people think this post adds to the discussion to you. I gathered the comments and displayed them as they appeared on the web page. Then I organized the comments into reading paths to restore the disrupted agency to see how they were related to each other. The numbers of postings were tabulated, names were edited for privacy issues, and a tally was kept for the number of participants who posted multiple messages. The sequential organization was studied following the chronological order, the addressivity, and the topic. Content analysis revealed whether the post contained pro or against vaccine-related instances. I used a tag for each comment with the date, the hours, and the addressing. I'm sorry for the overlap, but that one is the label. And I focused on agency pairs that are sequences of utterances that are mutually dependent and are produced by two participants, accountability for taking part in the discussion, and sequences pointing to the strategies employed to support one theory or one contributor, and analyzing if and how they discredited the contrasting position, which led to confirmation niche. The first post was analyzed in its individual dimensions, since it opens the thread and takes advantage of distinct specificities. Here, the user I called B starts the discussion with a post entitled "To Those of You Who Still Believe blah blah blah," which contains a plea to read an article taken from a parenting website. The article is written by a doctor and refers to the history of the vaccine diatribe, endorsing the necessity of vaccines and refusing connections between vaccines and autism. The message is an initiating faster, and its internal design accomplishes several functions. It contains a nomination of an addressee, those who blah blah blah, a selection of recipients that are already implicitly intended as an opposing group, and a preparation for a response as an invitation paired with the kind acceptance rejection. Now, in digital context, the speaker starting the conversation cannot say who is going to read their lines, the recipient. And even the selection of the addressee does not correspond with a controlled identification of the recipient. So the subject only identifies a theme that involves anyone interested in the topic. The exchange is safe for the author because of anonymity, login time, etc. But it's also highly risky in that it is open to comments from different positions. The sentence starts a thread where opposing groups exchange their opinions. Again, 187 answers that are addressed to the forum in general, to B, the opening starters, or in replying to some individual users. The time lag between messages varies considerably, from very short, minutes, or very long, even months. The asynchronous interaction that follows, displaying agency pair formats for and against vaccines, is construed in a sequence organization, the first part being the opening post and the second part being the replies. Messages are shown in a continuum, which increases both the perception of a disrupted agency of logically related messages. But however, the loosening relevance is managed by participant by either adopting the reply tool as an agency-based control to restore relevance, or by addressing, which means contributors indicate the conversation pair to which they are responding to, as here in example 31, where the user writes in the forum addressing these PS, and thus acknowledging or understanding of the two-part sequence. Users employ the generic Q when writing in reply, or use the addressing so the polylog is understandable. Loosening relevance is also managed by the mechanism of word association, which is a form of interturn relation played on lexical repetitions. For example, here the expression "shame on you" in four, is used several times, but even without addressing. After several irrelevant turns, without being a reply to the comment number 4, this comment 111 repeats the expression, and no one replies or feels attacked by the comment, because readers interpret these 111 comments as a reply to 4 and do not feel personally involved in the exchange. The exchange has a dynamic dimension. It produces topic degeneration and other discursive activities as the sort of attack defense of individual choices. Conflict is salient and comes in the form of irony and sarcastic comments. One main reason of conflict is legitimacy. As already mentioned, the first post uses addressing as a rhetorical expedient to start a bidirectional exchange between two opposing groups and build an unsafe interactional ground. To validate their utterances and to protect the self, contributors display legitimacy for taking part in the exchange through accountability and credibility. In fact, legitimacy is maybe the first step taken when entering the debate, and it is polysemous, The participants' role in society is addressed, the job as in 1, the experience of parenthood as in 2, or personal reading, studies, knowledge in general in 3, or simply because it is a space to express their thoughts and validate their right to take part in the discussion as in 4. Sometimes, as discourse strategies to display and construct accountability in the group, users refer to sources in scientific knowledge that are also used as self-defense or to display accuracy of one's information, like in the example. Users do present themselves, yet they avoid giving details. They articulate their credentials and are challenged or accepted in such negotiation of trust, as in the example. This leads to interactional conflicts where participants have to save their respectability and self-esteem. Conflict starts from disagreement or difference and is characterized by competition, no mutual adjustment, and no cooperation, so the willingness to interact. This interaction on the slide shows how the participants co-construct the conflict by maintaining their position. The two parties match each other's tactics with sarcastic question answers and personal addressing. Participants do not accommodate and signal dissatisfaction and disrespect for the interlocutor's actions and beliefs, which in turn results in the recipient's negative reaction. In other cases, conflict is accommodated, like here in this example. G adjusts a reply and concedes some space via hedges. I just want to say, some do indeed work, I'm only, and that's all. But she maintains her position. Going back to the example HH2B, the author here uses images, go down the tubes, exaggeration, experiential knowledge, and generalization. So thousands, parents who witness, children who are normal and healthy, and then move on an emotive level, fueling fears and distress on parental autonomy and suspicions. And here Professor D'Amata can say something about government and big pharma. And the replies are rhetorically aligned, as in the examples. There's also the possibility of fitting one's message and information into personal narratives, like in the third example. The narrative here about the needs is used as a proof and self-legitimation, moves the focus from the message to a personal emotion, and this will be supported by like-minded group. A speaker then uses emotional talk when his talk is threatened, or in turn to threaten the interlocutor. Aggressiveness is an emotional discursive strategy to construct the speaker's self in relation to others and position the self in the trouble interaction, fueled by the use of irony, sarcasm, irritating and irritated tones that cannot be tolerated nor approved by the interlocutor, like in the example. The hostile interaction affects the exchange and diverges the focus from topic to tones. The exchange here has moved on to a personal level and compromises the self. The participants then leave the interactional ground with the same idea she had before the exchange, and more than that, they seem to have reinforced the original position. They say bad reaction. So using content analysis, I grouped the post in post against vaccine, pro-vaccines, and neutral or trolling comments. Participants with AV positions write more than PV's writers, showing a significant involvement in the topic. The floor is thus managed by AVs. Despite the threat started with PV positions, the digital space becomes a place to favor comments that confirm anti-vax ideas. While pro-vax participants contribute to the debate addressing to the forum, the most influential activity among AV participants is replying to PV and talk to each other. The participants attack for their beliefs, for their system of beliefs, confirm their stances among themselves, and reinforce their standpoints when standpoints were opposed. Confirmation bias is shown by the choice of one's interlocutor, as those who have parallel ideas support each other, whereas the debate with opposing groups only use aggressiveness or ironic content. Moreover, groups in closed system produce an echo, that is the repetition of the same ideas, sometimes distorted throughout the repetition, as here in the example and the case of Mercury. So basically, my studies are based on the assumption, or I'd rather say the fact, that the digital sphere has created new opportunities for multi-way dialogues in which conflict is an interactional process that constructs groups with different beliefs. But contributors are not focused on the message, but on the possibility of fitting the topic into personal narratives. They reduce the complexity of reality to individual standpoints, and the interaction only reinforces one's ideas. So the participatory framework becomes a confirmation niche and a barrier to a critical attitude. And this influences the way users are informed and shape their worldviews. These, I have a long list of references, but here I put the articles that in a way resumes the list of references, and that's my last slide, or better, this one is my last slide that was with a specially dedicated to Marco Venuti.
Chiara Sciarrino insegna letteratura inglese presso il Dipartimento di Scienze Umanistiche dell'Università di Palermo. I suoi principali interessi di ricerca ruotano attorno alla letteratura irlandese da sempre, con un focus su Joy Studies, anche se si occupa anche di letteratura britannica e anche Translation Studies. È membro del comitato scientifico della rivista Irish Studies. È autrice studi irlandesi, proprio primo titolo, e poi ed è autrice anche di numerosi contributi in volume e rivista. I più recenti sono incentrati su Daniel Defoe e Oscar Wilde. Il titolo della sua relazione oggi è Irish Studies, Research Approaches and Data Collection Today. La ringrazio per il suo contributo e le do subito la parola.
Okay, thanks, Manuela, for inviting me. It's a pleasure. Okay, today, well, I tried not to talk too much about myself, even though, I mean, it will be inevitable. But my idea is just to give you some basics in a way in order to arouse your interest, to make you interested in the field, the huge field of Irish studies. Perhaps there are some of you who I don't know. I really am. I would have loved to know more about what each of you PhD students are doing, but I hope that there might be someone who, after my talk, my contribution, will get some interest and will get back to me saying that my contribution has been of some help in some way or another. Now, I'm not going to talk in particular about, well, I will do that briefly at the end if I have time, about my research, but I just want to show you the means by which you can get interested, or you can focus on, or you can start focusing on Irish studies for your research. Now, I work for the Department of Humanities at the University of Palermo, and well, da sempre, I think she said da sempre. I mean, my interest in Irish studies can be dated back to when I was an undergraduate. I studied, well, for my undergraduate thesis, the work of Flann O'Brien, who was, well, I don't know if any of you know him. And then I moved to Ireland to do an MA in Anglo-Irish literature, which was a big opportunity for me to continue, well, to properly studying, kind of properly studying. It was just the beginning, Anglo-Irish literature, by which we mean literature produced in English, written by Irish writers. I also had the opportunity to work as a language assistant in two public schools in Dublin at the same time, and this is why, and this is how I became interested in looking at the way we Italians were portrayed in Anglo-Irish literature and drama. And so basically for my research as a PhD student, which I began my PhD in Dublin, and then I continued it in Milan. I focused on the way the Italians were portrayed in Anglo-Irish literature and drama. And so to me, it was very much like the stage Irishman was being portrayed in English drama. I was interested in the stage Italian in a way. So some of my earliest publications are about the influence of Italian, are also about the influence of Italian culture, be it music, visual arts, and literature itself on Anglo-Irish literature. So basically, I focused, my PhD was well, kind of officially a PhD in comparative literatures. So my approach was comparative, of course. Now, so today I will try to, well, I mean, briefly, look at how you can approach the study of different aspects of Irish studies from, well, thanks to the use of methodologies that you already know, or approaches that you already have, I mean, and or theoretical frameworks that you might already know. But I mean, this is just because the focus is obviously Irish studies. So basically, if okay, I think I can read that. I need my glasses, which are in my backpack, but no, that's fine. No, that's fine. I can read the big screen. Now I have this problem. Now I have had this problem for a little while. Now, various, it's time, it's age, unfortunately. Now, various methodologies. Yeah, exactly. Now, various methodologies. I mean, you can look, I don't know, many of you, can you raise your hand just out of curiosity? How many of you do work on literature, on literary studies? Okay. Well, two. I mean, and what? Okay, three. Okay. Well, okay. I mean, the question was, well, mainly asked to PhD students, no, no, to PhD students, but okay, this okay. Now, obviously, if you're interested in, you can simply look at the history of literature, of Anglo-Irish literature, and find lots of materials to study. And you know, there are lots of works that have been published over the years about what we call the so-called Irish classics. I mean, they're not English. Don't call them English classics. That is Joyce and Beckett and Yeats, obviously, Shamusini as well, who once complained about being included in an anthology of British poetry. He publicly complained about that. But now, focus on history. Obviously, drama and historical events. If you look at the work of, for instance, Sean O'Casey and among others, and Singh, of course. I mean, for those of you who know Irish theatre, there's a focus. I mean, there's always a focus on politics, and Yeats himself as well. I mean, politics and literature, but means also looking at contemporary times and at most recent times, what is happening also in Northern Ireland with Brexit. And there are obviously, especially, discussions about this topic during conferences. I'm going to share with you some of the links and some of the information about national and international conferences organized by associations, and so there's a focus on Brexit, obviously, and on the consequences that Brexit has had on writings produced in Northern Ireland, and obviously dystopia. Now, what has come to me, has come to my mind, obviously, as to the word dystopia, Brexit, dystopia politics, is the most recent Booker Prize novel by Lynch, who is set in a dystopian Ireland, and which doesn't seem so much distant from our contemporary times, but it's a lot. It's a lot about politics and about things going wrong. But anyhow, digital humanities and eco-critical readings and literary and theatrical works, statistics, and aging studies. Now, as to digital humanities, aging studies, and eco-critical approaches, there is some research going on, and possibly also some guidance can be given on that at some universities in Italy. Now, I'm also here. I'm happy to be here also as a member of the board of the first inter-university center of Irish studies in Italy, which has been in a way founded by myself and the three colleagues from three other universities, Sassari, Turin, and Florence. And in particular, at the University of Turin, my colleague Irene De Angelis was kind of updating me on what they're working on. And as to Irish studies themselves, there is some research going on about aging studies and eco-critical approaches as well. Now, stylistics, I mean, this is what I've been working on as well at some time, recently, as I tried to apply a stylistic approach to the analysis of a novel by James Joyce. So I've tried to combine obviously the study of the language, the analysis of the language and the literary language to our literary work. So obviously these can be on all equal a valid means approach to look at aspects of Irish studies. Medical humanities is also something they're working on interim as well, and then gender studies again. Interdisciplinary approaches, in a way, this is what I have been doing, that is looking at aspects of Irish literatures and Irish culture in general, and trying to compare and to evaluate the role that other cultures and other literatures have had on modern and contemporary literary and dramatical productions. So intertextuality is obviously something that comes that can be discussed. Focus on arts. I mean, I don't know if there is any of you that are interested, in, for instance, in music or in drama and in cinema. Obviously, I mean, visual arts and literature. This is also what I've tried to do as a postdoc student, which I've never, I mean, a study that I've never completed, because then I moved back to Palermo. You know, I tried to look at the way visual arts, especially Italian works of art that are, well, mainly religious and about religion, have inspired contemporary Irish writers, because I felt that while being there, that a different kind of religiosity was being lived by Irish writers. Now, I mean, well, now times have changed in a way, so I'm not too sure if this kind of approach can produce still interesting results, but perhaps it would be worth trying. But anyhow, music in Irish theatre, I mean, that's also quite an interesting topic. Now, topics. I mean, these are some of the areas of studies on aspects of Irish culture about or on which one could work. Obviously, cinema, Irish folklore, and Celtic mythology. I mean, there is obviously someone working in Italy as well about on Irish English, and in particular, and sometimes also on the way works as to literature, works written by Irish writers have been rendered into Italian, because obviously the peculiarities of Irish English often cannot be rendered into properly, or I mean, properly is not the right adverb, but I mean, it could be a long discussion going on about that in Italian. Diaspora, Irish diasporic periodical cultures, and so on. Famine, it's something on which colleagues from other universities in Europe are working on, especially in Holland. There is a colleague called Margaret Corporal who is kind of really focusing on working on that. She has had funds from the European Union, and she is really working hard on that. Post-colonial Ireland, think about Declan Calvert, for instance, and his major studies about that. But I mean, there is a lot, immigration and Anglo-Irish emigration, and the famine is always something is one of the most recurrent topics when studying also as a postgraduate student in Ireland. And History of Anglia, and then obviously as well, you can look at different times, different periods of the history of literature being produced both in English but also in Irish. I mean, as when living in Ireland, even though I must admit, I mean, I can say that because I've tried to do that. Learning Irish is not that easy, and but I mean some of the Irish literature is translated also in English, and so you can also work on translations themselves of works originally written in Irish. Now, this is a list of universities where you can, as a PhD student, but of courses that you can attend as a PhD student, also from any university in Italy. I remember that when I was doing my MA in IUCT in Dublin, there was a PhD student who was attending the same classes as mine, and she was from Spain. But I mean, obviously, there were classes specified in different topics, which were of a lot of help to her. Now, there are lots of courses being offered by universities that one can attend. Some of them are they're about literature. Some of them are about, generally speaking, about Celtic studies. Some of them include the teaching and learning of history, Irish history, and theater as well, and and obviously Irish itself. Like for instance, the last one, I'm not going into well, obviously, well, I mean, into lots of them because of time. But tell me when my time, okay, is up. A couple of minutes only. Okay. Uh, 4 minutes. Oh my gosh. Okay. Now, I was kind of thinking that I was quick, but I'm not now. So anyhow, if you have any questions, please feel free to write me an email and discuss about discuss with me about anything that comes to your mind as to Irish studies. Now, MA, again, this is a list: Irish folklore and ethnology. I mean, some of you might be interested in music, and there are a lot of summer schools that you can attend as a PhD student as well. Some of them offer scholarships. I had myself. I got some scholarships also as a PhD student to attend some summer schools. So they're not just for undergraduates, but also for postgraduates from all different countries. Now, I just want to. These are international associations and centers. So now, apart from Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I didn't notice. So again, feel free to contact me if you want this list. But if you go to the GCL website, you will find lots of these links. Yes, we do have a website. We do have a Facebook account and an Instagram, even though we haven't been that active socially speaking, so to say, recently, but we will do update the all accounts. Now, what else? So this is a list of cultural institutions. Again, if you write to some of these, you will get the opportunity to have funds. You will find, you can inquire, but I mean, you can ask me as well. Some of these offer scholarships. We have also included, for instance, the Royal Irish Academy of Music. I mean, I don't know if there is anyone interested in music as well. For instance, music and politics is another important topic, perhaps to be to work on. Now, so this is a list of summer schools. Okay, you have the Beckett Summer School. Oh, now I have also included summer schools that take place in Italy, like the well-known Trieste Joyce Summer School, and also, I mean, it's not included in here, but obviously, well, we have to thank the colleagues who work in Rome to arrange the yearly Joyce conference in January, usually in January, for the Joyce of the James Joyce Italian Foundation. So lots of things going on. I mean, there are people spread in Italy working on different authors and on different areas of research. While Trieste could be possibly generally associated with Joyce, and Rome in some way also mainly with Joyce, but and then there are people working in Milan and Pavia as well. Yes. Okay, opportunities where to publish. Now, and just I will be brief. Now, Studi Irlandesi is an A-indexed journal edited by Fiorenzo Fantaccini in Florence, and it's a really good opportunity to publish alongside with the main journal edited by the colleagues who work for IASIL, the International Association. So Studi Irlandesi publishes, they do publish one, or we do publish one issue a year now because of lack of funds. Well, at least better than nothing. Yeah, I know. Now, well, the list continues. Yes, Irish Studies Review is also one of another journal, which is in the nella lista praticamente delle riviste di fascia A che trovate se volete pubblicare nelle riviste appunto articoli di fascia A. So and then again, and then last, this is a list of websites of libraries of different universities. So library catalogs mainly, where which can be used in order to find material about all aspects of Irish studies. Now, to conclude, I mean, I know that there's not time. I just wrote. I'm going to leave this to you. 3 volumes, and this is in.
Grazie. Thank you very much, Chiara. Marianna, will you join us here, please? Marianna, will you join us here, please? Two very dense presentations.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, guys, so rapidly. Again.
So,
Everything was clear.
Anyhow, so if you want to write me, my email address is chiara.sciarrino, SCARRINO @unipa.it. Okay, but anyhow, if you want to, you can ask Manuela for my email address.
Yeah, just Google statement
and
and that's it.
I have one last thing to say. Now, CISIL organizes, arranges, or is planning to have also PhD students who would like to. I mean, we are kind of arranging at the moment, for lack of funds, again, online events.
Mariagrazia Nicolosi, conosciuta da moltissimi di noi, insegna letteratura inglese presso il Dipartimento di Scienze Umanistiche del nostro Ateneo di Catania, dove tiene corsi non soltanto appunto di letteratura inglese, ma anche di gender studies. I suoi interessi culturali e di ricerca spaziano dalla letteratura early modern, soprattutto femminile, teatrale, utopica, filosofica, libertina, a quella contemporanea, postmoderna e postcoloniale. È autrice di saggi, monografie, traduzioni letterarie, e la più recente è Margaret Cavendish, Il mondo sfavillante, uscito per i tipi di Vanda Edizioni nel 2022. Il suo talk oggi si intitola Literary Cultural Studies, Patterns and Practices. Le do la parola e insomma siamo pronti.
Thank you. I'll try to be as quick as possible with the premise, the general premise. And first question I asked myself while preparing this little talk was, what patterns shall I single out before starting discussing the actual topic? And then how do we recognize patterns in literary and cultural studies? And how do we retrace the working of these patterns when we pay attention to the actual practices, critical and theoretical practices that emerge out of these patterns? So by way of an unusual introduction, I'd like to share with you a very short segment from a video by performer, artist and writer Jade Montserrat. She was born in London in 1981, second generation African, and she's been working on the themes of race and the vulnerability of the body in relation to specifically hot themes along the historical specifications of Black British artists. She's based in the north, Scarborough, Yorkshire, and before we get to the point of this short presentation, I'd like you to focus your attention to the bodily narrative that you're going to see in this very short segment. Here we go. No. Oh my God. Sorry. What happens?
Vuole fare partire il video?
Sì. Oh.
È lì. Ok. Vediamo.
With all the expectations I created. Okay, here we are. There's no audio, just environmental sounds. Okay.
Torniamo alla presentazione.
Yes. The sound was more ghostly than I expected. You may imagine the sound of the artist's feet splashing into the water. The place where this little video was shot is the area where we imaginatively place set Wuthering Heights. So there is, again, a phantasmatic connection with a very famous literary classical text. But the way in which I would like you to consider, to reflect on the video you have just seen is by quoting from Sarah Ahmed's Queer Phenomenology, where she describes something which is uncannily literal in terms of what we have just seen. The relationship between following a line and the conditions for the emergence of lines is often ambiguous. Which one comes first? A path is made by the repetition of the event of the ground being trodden upon. We can see the path as a trace of past journeys. The path is made out of footprints, traces of feet that tread and that in treading create a line on the ground. When people stop treading, the path may disappear. And when we see the line of the path before us, we tend to walk upon it as a path clears the way. So we walk on the path as it is before us, but it is only before us as an effect of being walked upon. A paradox of the footprint emerges. Lines are both created by following, by being followed, and are followed by being created. The lines that direct us as lines of thought, as well as lines of motions, are in this way performative. They depend on the repetition of norms and conventions, of routes and paths taken, but they are also created as an effect of this repetition. So this is the frame by which I'd like to address the question of literary patterns, the way in which trends, turns, and returns are simultaneously created and followed upon. So this is the first path by which I've tried to single out what patterns, in very general terms, across the centuries, we have come to define the rules that we recognize by creating them. So the three great patterns that I've tried to single out have to do with three only seemingly separate approaches. The one is the ethical take, and so the question of the truth of literature, of culture. The second question is the materiality, the matter of the sign by which this truth manifests itself before us. The third line has to do with the dematerialization of the sign in terms of truth that disappears and the nostalgia for the presence of these disappearing truth. I think that across the centuries, literary studies, which incidentally have to be located ab initio as a religious origin story. The poet was the priest. So literary truth is ab origine, a religious, a metaphysical truth. Hence the awkwardness when we try to translate this sacred language into the building blocks of what we tend to do with words, concepts, messages, performances, in the way in which our artist did, simply by materializing with her own body this statement. Again, the paradox of the footprint is a point of convergence between the maximum abstraction, the idea behind the performance, and the maximum materiality of the gesture. They are an interface. So if we consider, for example, the structure of truth, and I've been quoting the obvious so that I can jump to quotation and I don't need even to comment upon them. I start with infamous or famous Plato, who established a pattern not simply because he was skeptical about the truth conveying value of fiction, of literature, but because this skepticism established a line which was never abandoned afterwards. Later critics, later intellectuals engaged with this issue of the truth and Plato's skepticism thereof in very interesting way, because just his disciple Aristotle inverted the terms of the truth of fiction versus the fictionality of truth with the, again, infamous, well-known theory of mimesis, in which the paradox of the footprint we have seen physically before is conceptualized with words. The trace of this discourse is easily found when we consider that the truth of the matter is the matter of language. So the materiality of the sign is once again at the origin of our patterns around literary and cultural discourse. And we are Italians, so it's easy for us. I don't need to quote De Vulgari Eloquentia. Dante established the vernacular, so the language of the body, we may say, as the foundational tool to convey his truth. And since we are English literary students here, or linguists here in this room, we don't need to pause long on the inheritance, the legacy of this discourse in Geoffrey Chaucer's significant choice in exactly this term. The materiality of the sign for Chaucer become the oral experience, the experience of the ear along the same conceptual lines. And if we move on, we stay within the question of the ethics of literature. And it's interesting that Philip Sidney, in one of the earliest essays about poetics, so the theory of literary criticism, he quotes Plato by misquoting him. So it's not just a question of misunderstanding, but of turning Plato's point around. Again, you remember Jade, she was turning around the block, the wood block, by way of self-orientation. So Sidney is self-orienting by turning the discourse around. It's not a lie, properly speaking. It is just what remains of a lie when it is reconceptualized, reused. This is not Plato, but it is Plato's in Sidney, or Sidney's Plato. Strongly enough, the question of ethics is again at the foundation of early modern experiments in this sense. Joseph Conrad had a lot to worry about the ethicality of writing literature, of writing through his refracted cultural experience, which happened again within the materiality of a trilingualism. And you find that the interesting thing is that he imagines the operation that we saw in Sidney as bringing to the light. Truth has to be brought to light. Sidney buried that truth. He completes that procedure by intervening in that line of thought, that line of reasoning, by bringing it back to the surface, to light. And this material operation in reality is conducted along the vocabulary and the jargon of transcendence. Bringing to light, of course, it belongs in the religious jargon, in the religious vocabulary. And surprisingly, somebody who quite obviously was not a sailor with an experience in actual life like Conrad, T. Holm, regarded as one of the foundational figures of modernism, aesthetician, theoretician, writer, etc., who notice what he's doing with his idea of truth. He regards the truth as the embodiment of truth, the manifestation, the materialization of truth. So once again, he's offering a turn around where we least expected it to find. So patterns like that around the concept of truth are realized, achieved by turning and returning. So we can now understand why we talk about the famous or less famous turns. The various literary critical trends are called turn. The linguistic turn, the structuralist turn, the historicist turn. I'm not interested in this specific case in the qualifier, but in the noun. The concept of turn is specifically based on this understanding of how patterns are established and we enter into a conversation with. So we turn around, and that's the concept of turn in a very literal sense, and at the same time in the least literal sense, as a metaphor which exhausts itself completely. So I don't need again to focus on the moments, the steps, the footprints that characterize these turns, because are the cliched, stereotypical ones. What I'm more interested in is the mechanism, the process through which these very obvious steps become a practice which never erases its opposite 100%, but it keeps it as a kind of nostalgia, a ghost, which reappears at the next turn. So we know that when structuralism appeared within the field of literary studies, literary criticism, at the beginning of the last century, that was the very first moment in which we became aware of theory being appropriated and imported into the field of literary critical practice. We should remember that in the 18th and 19th centuries, this work, this practice was based on two specific orientations. One which was flirting all the time with the materiality of culture. We may refer to biographical criticism. So the foundation is somebody who really breathed on earth. The other foundation is at the opposite, the very abstract one of transcendental, metaphysical criticism, to the point of consulting the seance, so the actual physical conjuring up of the dead on behalf of the living discourse. And once again, when we come to this, it's interesting that theory was imported into the literary critical practice at the point of maximum paradox, in which the material aspect of biographical criticism and this phantasmatic nostalgia converged in Victorian literature, and theory becomes the new ghost within the machine, the critical machine. So when we analyze the literary critical applications of linguistics, structuralist linguistics, we find this nostalgia in action. I don't need to pause on what this phenomenon was, but this nostalgia is conducted within the terms which should be hostile to literature, to the word of literature, which is based on ambiguity, on silences, etc. And the binarism of some physical sign which corresponds to the meaning is again a point of flight, which is expressed in, again, famous or notorious term, the ambiguity of literature. This is the way in which this theoretical appropriation of structuralist linguists become literary critical practice through this evanescent, elusive side of the ambiguity of the literary sign. Quanti minuti ho? Cosa posso fare? So, the other interesting thing is that structuralism became historically dominant in literary studies, not at the point of maximum evanescence, but when it had already found application within the factual, bodily field of anthropology and mythological narratives within the field of structuralism, so anthropology. So literature comes to this banquet at a point in which it was not invited. It is quite paradoxical that anthropology and social sciences lend literary critical practices the tools at this specific stage. So again, at a point of flight, because anthropology based on mythical narrative is a contradiction in terms. Please notice that. It is such an acquired field of criticism that we have become blind to this paradoxical moment in which actual cultural phenomena are analyzed subspecies of myth, the most evanescent category through which we analyzed practical phenomena. So the quote is from Barthes Mythology. Again, I can afford the luxury of skipping it because it's notorious and we don't need to comment or pause on it. So I can move on to the next moment in which these mythical structures became once again the ghost in the machine of the next moment. Post-structuralism. Post is a strange word because it contains an obvious temporal qualifier, but at the same time, this post is in the literal sense of post-note, something that comes locally at the end of the page, in the margin of the page. And again, this is a paradoxical way of approaching literary critical practices, because we know, again, it is notorious that deconstruction debunked or undid the concept of truth. It was pulverized, not simply problematized. But how? By providing the widest context possible to the literary object. So this strange idea that we have about deconstruction in its classical form, Derrida's deconstruction, when we quote this famous, there's nothing outside the text, and we tend to believe that Derrida is setting aside the physical material text. Shouldn't we instead, considering that this nothing outside the text means that Derrida had the ambition to attract everything outside the text inside its borders? So this very complex, heady turn in literary critical studies, in actual fact, joins hands with the return or the turn to material culture, what was manifested around the same period, around the concept of historical studies and new historicism in particular. Again, these patterns are not single, separate, independent trends. They cannot exist independently one of the other. Consider how new historicism was triggered off by a new approach to historiography, launched again famously by a 1973 book by a historian, a professional historian, Hayden White. The title is Meta-History, and he analyzed 19th century historians in particular. So this book, which invokes the materiality of the linguistic sign as it belongs to the archives of the past, so more material than history of ideas, the great historical figure, etc., which are, if you consider it seriously, more abstract archetypal ideas, White instead approached the physical archives by including within the text the outside, or what up to the point was outside of the text, but he did it paradoxically through linguistic and even rhetorical means. He literally uses the categories of genre criticism by defining past literary historiographers under the rubrics of comedy or tragedy or farce, the categories he found in archetypal literary criticism, Northrop Frye. So history and the discourse of history, historiography, delves into the material documents through the most abstract paradigms available at the time. So new historicism is again another paradoxical turn within these use of previous or contemporary patterns against the grain by turning them around. New historicism, again, has been disqualified. It's almost embarrassing today, but bear in mind, all these phenomena never disappear in an absolute way. So they stay with us and they reappear under a different guise. So new historicism is also what Derrida touched upon in some of his later books, in which he discounted the earliest statements in which he wanted to provoke, if we like. And this return to the spatial dimension is the point at which all the post phenomena, post-structuralism, post-historicism became a kind of stain, a stain in the literary critical field, and the post became the transcultural, transnational, transhistorical, etc. This prefix couldn't exist if the turn to the locality of literary phenomena had not already happened with new historicism, particularly in the very materialistic form that it took at Birmingham in the 1980s with cultural materialism, which was very topical, very spatial, very localized. The spatial turn is still with us because it has produced a breeding of classical phenomena in a very unprecedented way. Again, I can skip it. We don't need to talk the jargon of mapping territory, borders, etc. These are obvious hits in the tools we have at our disposal, but not at the expense of what came before. So the post has not been killed off. It is in that spatial turn, it has become the trans, which we are more attentive to now. The spatial turn looks like a very abstract phenomenon, but in reality, when we consider the epiphenomena, so the actual manifestations of this attention to the map, which is again the most abstract manifestation of space, it is a projection of what we want space to mean, we come to the trans as a process, a practice of translation. To this phenomenon, post-colonial critical practices belong to, again, infamous today, but for example, the first English translator of Derrida, he is a post-colonial theorist, Gayatri Chavaporki Spivak. So again, post-colonial studies and post-deconstruction in its spatial turn becomes the terrain on which post-colonial discourse can develop. Think about Jade Montserrat. She was doing spatial criticism in a very post-colonial way, because she was alluding with her orientation in that specifically connoted space, her conversation with a Victorian classic which contains a secret script of colonial, shameful colonial discourse. Eco-criticism, believe it or not, belongs in the club, but again, not in the way in which we expect it to perform this turn. It is not the focus on the spaces that decides what eco-criticism cares about. It is a question in which we, once again, pay heed to language as an ecosystem. So eco-criticism, it's not just conceptually this very laudable attention to the environment, return to nature. And again, romantics did that. So we are getting back to that point. I'm almost finished. The way in which we do it is by reconceptualizing the use of language in the transhuman or post-human environment, so that we can theorize the ecology of language. The ecology of language is what we are allowed to move along this paradox of the footprint. And literature, in this case, can be understood if we apply this spatial metaphorics, literature read as cultural ecology. So this way of understanding eco-criticism does not apply to the world, but applies to the literary words. So we are ecologically minded, not only with respect to the interface, but with these text that we approach again in this way. It seems like a very utopian, very abstract point of arrival, but in actual fact, eco-criticism is very closely connected to the new interest in materialism, or materialisms in the plural, as we can understand this concept in connection with new historicism, cultural materialism, and matter in the way in which thing theory has applied this concept. Again, it's a paradoxical point of contact, because thing theory is the way in which, in a very ambitious way, a few critics, mostly feminists, gender theories, etc., tried to revalue matter in and by itself. The funny thing is that matter, understood in this way, takes a number of forms which are very transcendental. So when we consider books as objects, this is a transcendental proposition. When we consider the act of reading as a material practice, again, we can only make sense of this activity if we take the trouble of applying metaphysical categories, or if we consider it narratives. So stories from the point of view of objects, we got plenty in contemporary literature, particularly in the English-speaking world. Again, how can we understand it narratives if we do not welcome the feelings, the proposition that objects bear feelings in the haptic sense, so how we feel object and the way in which objects feel. So again, this is not matter as inert raw material. This is a transcendental category. Now we understand why Bruno Latour came into the picture, because he started his career as a philosopher in religious study. I turn for the last time, so I finish in time. This is the last turn. No, not really. So the very last turn. Literary criticism started as transmogrification of religious discourse. With matter and with vibrant matter, this transcendental understanding of matter, we get back to this religious discourse. So I turn for the last time. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. It was fantastic. It was fantastic. Round of applause, big round of applause. Thank you so much for this brilliant talk. Brilliant, brilliant talk. Any questions that you may want to ask?
A few passages, for example, about memory studies, which again, it's an illustration of this paradox of the footprint, because memory studies started as neurological studies phenomenon, so to do with trauma studies, with the Holocaust, etc. So to do with not even books or words, but about the gaps, the silences between the actual words. And then it moved to the monuments, so with the material reminders of what is not there. It's quite paradoxical, because trauma is materialized in the monument according to this turn of also the affective turn. And then the affective turn, which again, affect theory is a Renaissance purvor, and it's still again revisited, turned around. Today, affective theory is applied to thing theory, to id narratives, etc. So it's quite interesting that we never lose the past. We turn, and we turn to orient ourselves, not to orient the object, but to orient the subject. Yeah.
Marco Venuti, insegna lingua e traduzione inglese presso il Dipartimento di Scienze Umanistiche dell'Università di Catania, dove tiene corsi anche di Corpus Linguistics. Le sue linee di ricerca coniugano la linguistica dei corpora, l'analisi critica del discorso, linguaggi specialistici, con un focus in particolare su giornalismo e anche sui nuovi media. E infatti gli ultimi contributi si concentrano proprio sulle strategie di inclusione ed esclusione delle interazioni online e offline e sul concetto di political correctness sui Twitter. Il titolo del talk è A Path to a Successful Career, Critical Metaphor Analysis a Neoliberal Academia. Grazie mille, professore Venuti. Round of applause.
Thank you, Manuela, for the kind introduction. Thank you to the AIA board for inviting me to contribute to this day. I promise I will try to be probably shorter because I can skip part of the presentation. We're all tired. It's been a long day, and we can move on. These are just examples to show why I chose the title of the presentation, to say that the use of the path metaphor, but we will get back to that, is a fairly standard and consolidated practice in university language, we could say. Just slide to show you a brief outline of the presentation. I may skip the metaphors in institutional university website if necessary, because we can probably get to the point also without that part of the presentation. So let's start from, say, the beginning. Conceptual metaphors and conceptual metaphor theory. Very famous publication by Lakoff and Johnson in 1980, Metaphors We Live By, which was republished with an additional chapter rather than a second edition in 2003. Probably everyone is familiar with what conceptual metaphors are, but I would say that a brief recap helps. They start their book with this example. And the basic assumption of their contribution is that we normally use conceptual metaphors to understand the world around us and therefore to talk about the world which is around us. And they use this first example to say that we conceive of arguments as if they were physical words, which allows us to talk about arguments borrowing vocabulary from the field of war-like conflict. Another metaphor, which is probably another conceptual metaphor, which is probably more useful for us, is that of life is a journey. In this conceptual metaphor, therefore, we see that there is a narrative relationship which allows us, as they say, to map meanings from the source domain, which in the phrasing of conceptual metaphors is the journey, onto the target domain, which is the life. So we plot meanings from the journey to describe our lives. As the illustrative examples here, which define life as a path from start to end, we don't need to read the examples, but they're there to prove how the kind of theory works. So moving on, a very brief introduction from where we started from, is that starting from conceptual metaphors, a whole line of research developed in the late 90s, early 2000, and moved on, actually, which rather than focusing on the cognitive aspects of metaphors, which was one of the main concerns of Lakoff and Johnson, focused on the communicative function that metaphors could have in their linguistic realization, based on the assumption that the linguistic realizations can be somehow mapped to conceptual domains. Here you see the quotation from Lakoff and Johnson, which clearly shows how this works. So Lakoff and Johnson said that the very systematicity that allows us to comprehend one aspect in terms of another, life as a journey, will necessarily hide other aspects of the concept. in allowing us to focus on one aspect of a concept, a metaphorical concept can keep us from focusing on other aspects of the concept that are inconsistent with that metaphor. So I think that the quotation from Lacan and Johnson makes clear why it could be exploited in critical metaphor analysis, where the idea of highlighting and hiding discourses is particularly relevant, and metaphors therefore are particularly successful in creating a link to specific intentionally constructed meanings while hiding other possible readings of the events which are described through metaphorical conceptualizations. Here you have, I'm not going to talk about them, just a selection of works to show you how it has been differently applied, starting from Elena Semino describing Silvio Berlusconi's discesa in campo, as he framed it, to show how the explicit choice of a metaphorical scenario was exploited by Silvio Berlusconi to say that he was actually founding a political party overnight, two studies, again, Elena Semino, Jonathan Charles-Black, and Andreas Musolf on the introduction of the euro currency. I quote them because I did my PhD on the representation of the euro in the British press. I actually started my research project before this publication, but they turned out to be particularly inspiring. Two other works, such as the one by Andreas Musolf on the identity of different countries within the European Union, and the other two, Charteris Black and Alice Dania and Elena Semino, to show how at one point scholars started thinking about the possibility of analyzing systematically different metaphorical scenarios through the use of corpus tools. Okay, they are there for your reference. I'm not going to say anything more, rather than the last is not a citation of a specific work. We've seen in the last years a lot of studies focusing on how a particular phenomenon which had a huge impact on our lives was framed metaphorically, and different metaphorical framings referred to different ways in which the phenomenon was conceptualized and therefore talked about. Another diversion from the main topic of the presentation is another set of publication by a lot of the people I mentioned earlier, who decided that they had to agree. I'm referring to the Prageljas group. Gerard Stein was there, Elena Semino was there, Raymond Gibbs was there. A lot of people involved in studies on metaphor, both from a cognitive and a linguistic point of view, decided that they had to devise a set of rules for metaphor identification. Here you've got the set of rules that they agreed on. I think it was over a week they worked together discussing about the procedure for metaphor identification. It's quite a strict set of procedure, which helps somehow clear the path, using another metaphor, for a kind of shared way to proceed in defining what a metaphor is and what is not, because sometimes there have been wide discussions about whether conventional metaphors should be regarded as metaphor or not. I'm not going to answer to that question. It's far too complicated to do within the time limits that I have. Starting from metaphor identification procedure, Gerard Stein, one of the people from the same group, decided that perhaps they needed some wider ways in which to identify metaphors, and advocated for a rather more flexible understanding of what a metaphor is, mainly including more conventionalized forms of metaphorical domains. Having said so, Gerard Stein decided that he also needed a different approach to deal with what he termed deliberative metaphors. So having widened the way in which we identify what is metaphorical rather than literal, he felt the need to introduce the concept of deliberate metaphors as metaphors that are deliberatively used as metaphorical rhetorical devices. So not the sort of conventional metaphors which still create a link between different domains, mapping meanings from one domain onto another, but explicitly uses by, let's say, politicians, advertisers, so people who consciously, deliberately exploit this way in which metaphors work. Okay? Again, just for you to know that there are different ideas on how we approach the analysis of metaphors. Perhaps I have time because I've probably rushed through the premises, and I will show you some work I carried out later on, so after my PhD project, with a PhD student which I was supervising on the comparison of European university websites in English. The idea was that since the Bologna process, something that we are familiar with, there was a need within the university systems to come to terms with standardizing our university lives. The standardization implied that universities were required to have at least some of their online communication in English. Okay? The idea was that by comparing the university websites of non-English speaking countries in English and the corresponding websites of native English universities, we could get an understanding of how different universities, native English and non-native English, somehow talked about, we get back to the idea of the journey, as we will see in a moment. Some references of previous works on the notion of, and we will get back to the marketization of university discourse, which again links to the title of my presentation, and different works on metaphors in educational discourse in general, approaches of corpus linguistics on the analysis of, say, academic English, notably the work by Piper, and studies that draw on an approach of corpus linguistics, which is called Webber corpus, which was particularly relevant for our study because we benefited from a corpus which was collected and gathered by mainly Silvia Bernardini and Adriano Ferraresi at the University of Bologna in Forlì, which they called AQUAC EU, where the acronym stands for Academic Webes Corpus in European Union. There you've got a table showing the background of the corpus in terms of numbers of texts collected and number of words. So those are the two corpora. Obviously, I'm focusing here on the Italian subcorpus. The AQUAC EU corpus also contained data from all European countries. Okay. And let's go back to the journey. So we decided that one possible way of comparing what happened in the two subcorpora was focusing on, as we said earlier, the idea drawing on the life as a journey, on the academic life as a journey, which is a conceptual frame that describes the student's experience as a path. It describes the student's experience as a path, both in its spatial and temporal dimension, focusing on the beginning, say, middle stages, and final achievement. as I said earlier, it's a very conventional metaphor, but this does not mean that it may not have some ideological implications in the way it structures our experience as people within the academia. Here I'm quoting from a study on the journey metaphor, which describes the ways in which the journey metaphor is linked to somehow a narrative frame of the quest, where we've got different stages which help us understand what happens through the life of people within the academia. So the call stage, the journey proper, the arrival and frustration, so the obstacles that we meet, the final ordeals, and the goal, which is the end purpose of the journey. Practically, what we did is we compared the two subcorpora, the native English and non-native English, looked at the words that somehow could be linked to the path metaphors. We selected metaphor candidate terms. We checked whether they were literally or metaphorically used, and we divided them according to the three main steps of the journey, the beginning, the middle, and the end. I'm not going to say much about them. What I'm going to show, though, is that these are the linguistic realizations of the conceptual metaphor in the native corpus. These are the linguistic realizations of the conceptual metaphor in the, let's say, English as a lingua franca corpus. It's easy to see that there are fewer terms. Sometimes there are bad translations of Italian concepts related to the life within a university, which led us to the conclusion that by the comparison, we could say that the English as a lingua franca website display lack of awareness of effective communication, which at the time, but probably would say still true, may be said of their Italian versions as well as their English versions, even if some improvements are underway, and that somehow the choice of the linguistic realizations is mainly due to the compliance of the regulation. So universities had to write about their life rather than really describing the life of people who had a journey from beginning to end. Now, moving back to the beginning. So the path in neoliberal academia. Neoliberal academia, sadly, is something that we all have to struggle with. It started probably in the UK earlier than it did in Italy, but it's been a fairly established practice in Italian university for quite a long time now. And quoting from one of the references I quoted also when I talked about the marketization of academia, Morris and Sonston, they say that neoliberal academia has introduced a constant monitoring of activities. I'm sure that people who are familiar with UNVUR procedures will recognize a lot of the things in this quotation, typically where typically the little value is attributed to what is actually accomplished. Instead, there is an overly scrupulous fixation with accountability, monitoring, and reporting. This attention, we could say, to performance management poses threats to academic freedom, genuine academic productivity, and knowledge of advancement. So the idea is that these notions introduce also ways in which we have to account for what we do. So we have to set clearly identifiable targets, which can be counted and therefore evaluated. What I'm trying to suggest here, which is probably quite obvious in a way is that the metaphor of the academic life is a journey within the framework of neoliberal academia can easily be turned into a subset of that metaphor, which is academic life is a race. I'll just probably spend 2 minutes to say that even in Lakoff Johnson's book, there is this idea that there may be cross-references from different domains, so that by choosing one domain and a similar domain, they explain it far better than I'm doing now, by shared common concepts, we can draw simultaneously from both domains. So the race obviously still implies that we are going through a journey, but it adds further connotational meanings to the journey, introducing elements of speed as well as of competition. And here you've got 2, again, examples, which I'm not going to read, neither to comment upon, but they clearly show how this idea of a race where we have to quickly reach the target, regardless of the hurdles, the difficulties, because we are required to acquire as much as we can, as soon as we can. And there, again, I'm sure that a lot of you will recognize a lot of the things that pertain to our daily life in the academia. So what we can do, though, is somehow try to either counter the metaphors. So we still use the same metaphorical domains somehow to criticize them, as you can see here, where in the Johns Hopkins universities, there is a reference to the fact that one PhD student prioritized quality over speed. Okay, so the metaphor is still there. Otherwise, we would not need to talk about prioritizing something else in opposition to speed. Or in the other example, from a blog of a prior PhD student at the University of Manchester, talking about his PhD journey in ways in which he critically evaluates his process within the university. So what I would like to conclude with, and actually I kept my promise of being quicker than my 30 minutes, is that this issue of the neoliberal academia and the power of framing our university life within a semantic scenario is something which is particularly relevant for our early career researchers, because early career researchers, sorry, that was not meant to be, early career researchers are under considerable pressure by existing rules in the academia. They, as I said earlier, really have to speed through the hurdles they encounter to reach their expected goals. And what I would like to close with is that we, as their seniors, have a duty to try and help them, not ignoring the existing rules, because ignoring the existing rules would inevitably result in falling short of the desired goal of the path they have decided to follow, but by teaching them that existing alternative discourses exist. Discourses, for example, of cooperation, and I'm sure that today's meeting was a good example in that direction. So discourses of cooperation rather than competition, of organic growth, as opposed to machine-like metaphors. And it's interesting that in neoliberal discourse, humanizing metaphors are nearly absent because they pose a threat to the idea of the audit concept that we discussed earlier. So, as linguists, as discourse analysts, and more generally as critical thinkers, we know all too well the importance of resisting the single narrative. So the academic journey is a race, but that is not the only one, through the adoption of alternative viewpoints, building counter discourses that create the necessary space, or probably we should say the necessary safe space, where people can grow according to their pace. Thank you.
I think this is the perfect conclusion of this day together. Questions that you may want to ask? Yes. Professor D'Amata. 3 questions, okay.
Shoot. Of course.
Which is kind of implicit on what you said when you outline the fields of study and towards cognitive side, of course, I mean, again, this is not a question, but just a the difference between kind of the cognitive side of metaphor and the more social, discourse-oriented metaphor. It's not like a hugely different. There are cognitive elements in the approach to metaphor as well. I mean, nowadays, as you know, this clearly that has how we see the body. So that's not the question. That's something like a probably reinforcement.
Oh, he's not using the microphone. Okay. No. It was. Thank you. Thank you, Paola, because otherwise.
Or probably I can start answering to that, which probably gives an idea of what the question was. Massimiliano was pointing out that I made a distinction between the cognitive aspects of conceptual metaphor theory and the communicative use of metaphors. Of course, I made a distinction which is less clear-cut than I put forth in the presentations, but I had to make choices. In 30 minutes, obviously that would have been an altogether different presentation, but I perfectly agree with you that obviously there is always an element of cognition in the use of metaphors. What I was referring to though is that the more cognitive side of conceptual metaphor then developed probably towards neurosciences rather than the linguistic realization, but of course that was more implied than said.
Oh, thank you. Yes, so we agree on that. Okay. No, the other thing is when you mentioned the comparison of corpora, the native versus the EFL, I mean the Italian websites in English, and we were all struck by the fact that the number of metaphors, of journey metaphors used in the Italian websites was a much smaller, which I don't know, maybe is it at least in part surprising given the fact that in Italian we have the same metaphors, like La vita è un viaggio, which is a long tradition, common roots with the English, of course, so biblical, religious, Christian, etc., etc. So nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, etc., etc. So I wonder why there are so few in the English translation or English version in Italian websites.
May I?
Sure.
First of all, the article I quoted about the journey metaphor being from English speakers mentioned the Pilgrim's Progress as a foundational way of talking about life as a journey and therefore life in academia as a journey. So that is definitely true. My understanding is that mainly it's due to the translation process. So what universities did was to make available in English texts which were not meant for the web. So they translated into English those horrible, formal, legalese texts describing what, let's say, Erasmus students have to do when they get to an Italian university. So first of all, they started from texts which were not communicatively meant for that medium, and they were probably poorly translated. Poorly translated means that rather than using the Italian wide range of vocabulary, which mirrors the native university websites wide range of vocabulary to talk about the path the students have, they resorted to the easy and not effective realization. One is, for example, they use orientation, which obviously we Italians recognize orientamento studenti. Orientation means nothing to a foreign student who has to understand what the life in an Italian university. That is why I probably presume that what they did is translating the official documents where university has to say that we have orientamento studenti, and what they did, they translated it into orientation of students.
Okay, so clearly there was a problem in kind of different registers as well as kind of translation skills, so to speak. Finally, just getting to the end of your presentation when you mentioned the countering metaphors, right? So, but using the same metaphors, but in a different way, right? Have you found the cases of actually using alternative metaphors? Because of course, using alternative metaphors also means erasing different emotions, appealing to different discourses. We have had, of course, very famous cases from 2020 onwards, all the COVID metaphors, mainly war metaphors, but there were also alternative metaphors, of course, that really communicated different discourses and different ideologies as well. So I wonder whether you found in your analysis also alternative metaphors rather than using the same rules of the game, so to speak.
Oops. Okay. Yes and no. The work that I quoted, one about the journey metaphors and the Pilgrim's Progress, advocated for a work metaphor in opposition to the journey metaphor, which they found in itself problematic. Somehow, in my closing remarks, I deliberately used some metaphorical framings, that of the organic growth, that of, let's say, cooperation, which itself is not a metaphor, but it implies a different approach. The answer is no, because I did not really analyze texts looking for different framings. What I wanted to put forth is that we do need them, and as seniors, we need to critically evaluate the way we talk about our university lives, because that is a way of teaching junior researchers that a different type of approach to university life is possible. Yeah. So the answer is no, because I did not really look for examples. Okay. I simply somehow implied some of them in my concluding remarks.
Well, that's stuff for another article. Then. Okay, thank you.
Sì.
Thank you so much. I was just actually wondering whether you realize that you're using, of course, Darwinian vocabulary. You use the word cooperation, which is so interesting in particular because it relies on this idea of evolutionary fitness, so that the young and fit and bravest are the ones who actually manage. Actually, no, you didn't say that. You didn't say that at all. No, that's the general version of Darwinism that still, I think, is spread around. One always tends to forget that Darwin was actually very keen on cooperation as essential to create community. So thank you so much, because that's exactly what we were trying to, I think, talk about in the morning, imagining that. I think we were trying to do that. Maybe I was wrong. Well, I was. So thank you so much. It's interesting. I see that when I mention Darwin, you look at me in a sort of, disenchanted way, possibly.
No.
But cooperation is very central to your discourse, but also to our general discourse. And we're all trying and find ways to survive to neoliberal academia. Although it's absolutely impossible in a way. So we know that it's a kind of an aporia. We know that we should do something, but we don't really have the language, the force, the power, and also possibly the motivation for doing that. But I would say that, wow, that was very, very interesting.
My reaction to Darwinism was due to the first quotation in this slide, which I skip in my need to gain time, where actually Darwinism is used even in a very different sense.
Yeah.
That is just to explain my reaction to your mention of Darwinism. But
yeah, but maybe that's the, you know, the easiest version of Darwinian hierarchization, as you mentioned. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
What should I say to you?
Mariagrazia, would you join us, please?